Not a matter of if, but when crisis will rock your world. I'm Roshini Rajkumar, crisis strategist, licensed attorney, and host of The Crisis Files. I am always seeking solutions for the crises around us with trailblazers who help us overcome. Dr. Micah Niermann is Chief Medical Officer and EVP of Clinical Affairs at Gillette Children's. He's the only physician on the Minnesota Governor's Advisory Council on Climate Change. This is the first time I'm talking climate change on the Crisis Files. That's mainly because Dr. Niermann's focus in this area presents a unique angle connected to people with disabilities. He's here for the case file I call Unequal Climate Impact. The World Health Organization calls climate crisis the single biggest health threat facing humanity. Many of us might not realize that people with disabilities make up more than 15% of the global population, but are disproportionately impacted by emergencies like fires, floods, and tornadoes. Especially poignant as we consider the fires in Los Angeles that broke out in January of 2025. Dr. Niermann, why is this the case?
So I can give you several tragic examples from the California wildfires that illustrate this, unfortunately, too well. There was a father and son, Anthony and Justin Mitchell, who passed away. They were waiting for an ambulance. The father also had a disability, but the son had cerebral palsy and was described as being bedbound, communicated only by computer. They unfortunately passed away from the wildfires. Then, not far away, in Malibu, Rory Sykes, who was a disability advocate, he also had passed away. His mother was unable to move him, and he succumbed to carbon monoxide poisoning. I think both examples illustrate the extra additional help that people with disabilities need, especially in emergency situations, but could also serve, too, as examples as we look at climate change and the entire impact it can have on people with disabilities.
All right, from that global kind of perspective, are you seeing this 15% of the global population in better shape compared with a decade or 20 years ago? Or how would you describe the state of things for people that live with disabilities?
So when it comes to climate change, there definitely has been improvement as far as awareness is concerned. And if we look at emergency preparedness, for example, Sherman Gilliams now heads the office in FEMA that relates to people with disabilities and being able to prepare and help evacuate people with disabilities. There are additional mentionings of people with disabilities and the need for addressing their issues for climate action plans, both when you look at climate action plans in the state versus countries across the world. However, not enough is being done by any stretch of the imagination. There is progress, but so much more progress is required.
Well, here's kind of a sobering statistic from 2022, a study by Climate Action Research Program. Only 37 of the 192 state parties to the Paris Agreement in 2015 referred to people with disabilities in their climate commitments, and only 46 of those 192 refer to people with disabilities in their domestic policies. So whether we're talking about country level, in the case of the United States, even sometimes state level, or just globally, people with disabilities get left behind, sadly, with these major earth-shattering type of events.
That's exactly right. You have to think of it twofold. One, we have to be mindful for what the impact is on climate change for people with disabilities. And then second, what is their involvement as we address those issues? And when we look at climate change, if we look at that first issue, we can see that there's significant impact on human health. Just as you described, it's the single greatest threat to human health. If you think about human health, everything that we do is impacted. Where we live, what we do for our occupations, what we eat, our connectedness with other people, everything impacts health. For people who have disabilities, that is compounded even more so. So if you think about the changes that come with climate change, so flooding, drought, heat waves, food insecurity, decreasing in nutritional value for foods, air pollution, all of these will impact disproportionately people with disabilities. So we have to be very mindful of how we are helping people with disabilities, not only addressing climate change, but how do we make sure that people with disabilities have their needs addressed appropriately. And that means they need to be at the table. They need to be stakeholders in helping to guide policies and regulations and responses. There's a phrase, nothing about us without us. This is very true for people with disabilities.
Yeah, well, that's a really great phrase. So just to set some definitions, when we talk about people with disabilities, what are we talking about? Who are we talking about?
So there are several definitions when you think of disability. So you could think of the American Disabilities Act or the World Health Organization. But really, when you're talking about disabilities, this is described as how major activities of living are affected. So simple things that we take for granted, breathing, how you eat, how you are mobile, how you interact with the world.
Even seeing and hearing.
Absolutely. So it's not just, say, somebody who is in a wheelchair. And it can be also regarding mental health. So people who have schizophrenia, for example, autism. Disabilities affect your ability to be able to live that fullest life. And so you can imagine then, with those disabilities, your ability to then respond to an emergency situation, just as the Mitchell family was unable to because of their mobility issues or communication. These are significant problems, but they're not ones that are insurmountable. We can certainly overcome these.
Let's talk about overcoming, because on the Crisis Files, we like to talk solutions. Certainly your geography, where you live globally or even in different states in the United States, can determine risk level. Are there some parts of the world or the United States where, I guess, risk level is even higher for people with disabilities? I don't know if that's the right way to say it. Or maybe there are some shining examples out there that we could all live up to.
Absolutely. You had mentioned previously, in the world population, 15% have disabilities. So that's around 1 billion people. 80% lived in developing countries. And if you think about where they are living, oftentimes these are in coastal communities. So the impact to them is disproportionate. If you look at the effect of climate change that we'll have on warming waters and fisheries and access to stable food, also with flooding and increased salinity for their drinking water. Where you live can have a dramatic effect when you have disabilities. You could also look at this too. People who have disabilities have a higher proportion of living within poverty. And so people who are in poverty have unstable housing, also live in more flood-prone areas or places with higher air pollution. All of these disproportionately impact people with disabilities.
Right. It is really not a simple explanation.
No.
And so the solutions need to keep that in mind. Let's talk about some of those solutions, Dr. Niermann. What can people do not only to protect themselves, but to protect their communities, the people they love?
The solutions happen on many different levels. And I think if you look at it from an individual level, as we refer back to the California wildfires, you could think of it as, how do you prepare you and your family and your loved ones for a disaster? If you need certain supplies, certain medications, access to electricity, what are those things that you need to be prepared for, have ready in case of an emergency evacuation? On a larger level, there is a need for education and advocacy. And I think that can happen in many different ways. Certainly when it comes to being able to advocate and educate the best we can, we have to start with data. So making sure that our local governments, not only departments of health, but also university systems, health systems, are coming together to work to really be able to have strong data to help us understand better from disasters what is happening with people, especially people with disabilities. To give you an example, when Hurricane Maria came through Puerto Rico, it's estimated that a third of the people who passed away from the hurricane did so because they had inadequate or lack of access to medical or appropriate medical care. But what we don't know is how many of those people had disabilities. The more we understand about how the disasters are affecting people with disabilities, the better we will be able to respond.
So I really find it interesting and admirable that you are the only physician on the Minnesota Governor's Advisory Council on climate change. all the things you're doing, you have a busy life. Why did you decide to take up that membership and be on that council?
I am incredibly honored, very fortunate to serve on the advisory council. I think it was just good timing when I was able to join. What has interested me as far as climate change is concerned, especially with people with disabilities, in part as due to my work as a physician, I see kids and adults, and I see them at Gillette Children's, which is a specialty hospital dealing specifically with people with disability. But I also had remembered one thing that has always stuck with me after Hurricane Katrina in 2005 were some of the statistics that came out of that years later and the effects that it had on children specifically. And then from that, 4.5 years out of Katrina, almost half of the kids who experienced the hurricane were still suffering mental health issues.
Wow.
And those are all kids. And so you can imagine then, too, when you bring in people with disabilities, what a profound impact this is going to continue to have for a lot of these natural disasters. So being a part of the advisory council has been an incredible honor. And to be able to lend a lens of healthcare to this has been incredibly beneficial.
Right. I think often when we hear about disasters, natural or man-made, we naturally think about the safety response and putting out the fire or fixing that building. And certainly there are human injuries or human casualties, but I don't know that we're always thinking of the medical response and what might doctors advise, because there are people out there, whether it's children or people with disabilities, who need unique reaction to these situations that most of us think about as a security response.
Absolutely. I'm glad you brought that up. When you think of that emergency response, we need better education when it comes to, say, emergency responders and knowing how to deal with, say, a young child who has behavioral issues with autism, as just one of those examples. But you're right. I mean, we have to be able to have a much more comprehensive understanding of people with disabilities, because it's not just a very monolithic population. These disabilities affect all types, all aspects of our human health. And so we have to have a better understanding from people who have disabilities of what are the resources and the help that they need in dealing with these particular crises.
And being able to respond themselves, people who love, your family members want to be able to be in a position to help if you need that help. But I guess education is so important, isn't it?
It is, absolutely. And it's education that goes both ways. It's education that medical providers, emergency responders, departments of health can give people with disabilities, but also people who have disabilities can give to all of us in what resources and assistance they need to.
Wow, well, these are some amazing issues. I applaud you for doing this work. And again, your work, and when it was brought to my attention by your amazing PR staff at Gillette Children's, I was like, we've got to talk climate change. I've been kind of waiting to talk about it, but wanted to talk about it in a unique way, in a way that wasn't all politicized, because that topic does get politicized. But I think we can all agree that children, adults, anyone that needs a little extra hand, or we just need to understand better so that they can live better lives, especially when it comes to climate change issues and natural disasters.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Micah Niermann. Really appreciate your insights today. Follow Gillette Children's on Facebook. Go to gillettechildrens.org to learn more about Dr. Niermann's work. Today's case file is presented by Mall of America. Mall of America. Great shopping, a dazzling and dizzying variety of attractions and restaurants. Did you realize Mall of America also hosts hundreds of events each year? Everything from high-fashion runway shows to visits from the hottest musicians. Pop-up celebrations ahead of movie premieres. Charity-related walks and holiday-themed experiences. You never know what you will find at our mall. For upcoming events and happenings, check out mallofamerica.com. Follow the show on YouTube and Instagram at The Crisis Files. Rate, review, and subscribe to The Crisis Files on your platform of choice. Check out our website, thecrisisfiles.com, to catch up on all case files and to share ideas for future case files. I'm Roshini Rajkumar. Join me next time on The Crisis Files.